Clara Evans had always been a quiet soul who spoke more to her thoughts than to people. Her life in the small boarding house where she worked as a seamstress was a series of gentle routines that filled her days with stillness but little joy. She rose before dawn to sweep the hallways, mend worn clothes, and serve breakfast to travelers who barely noticed her. She had no family left and no one who truly cared to hear her voice. The world felt too large and loud for someone like her, and so she had learned to shrink herself into silence, hoping to pass through life unnoticed. One winter morning, as the wind rattled the windows of the boarding house, a letter arrived from a friend who had gone west. The letter spoke of wide-open skies, golden, grass that bent like waves, and men who worked hard and long but came home to empty houses. The friend mentioned how many women had found new lives as mail-order brides, wives to ranchers and farmers who offered safety and companionship. Clara had read that line over and over until her heart began to stir with a strange ache. She had never imagined herself as a bride, yet something inside her longed for a place where she might be seen, not just pitied or passed over. For nights, she sat by the small lamp in her room turning over the idea until it took root. She told herself she only wanted to know more, but the truth was she wanted a chance at something different. When she finally found the courage to answer an advertisement in a newspaper, her hands trembled as she wrote. The man's name was James Walker, a rancher from Kansas who described himself as honest, hard-working, and lonely. He did not promise wealth or ease, only that he would treat his bride with respect. Clara liked the simplicity of his words. There was a warmth there, a steadiness that called to her. When his reply came, she held it to her chest before opening it, afraid that hope might spill out if she did. He wrote that he was touched by her letter, and that if she wished to come, he would meet her at the station and give her time to decide whether she wanted to stay. His kindness startled her because no one had ever offered her a choice before. He said he understood shyness, that he himself found it hard to talk to people sometimes, and that maybe they could learn together. The journey west was long and strange. The train cut through miles of frozen fields and endless horizon. Clara had never seen so much land or felt so small within it. She clutched her small satchel and stared out the window, wondering if she was foolish to think a man like him would truly want her. She imagined his disappointment when he saw how plain she was and how soft her voice sounded when she tried to speak, when the train finally slowed at the dusty little station. The sun was sinking low, painting the sky in fire and gold. James was there, waiting tall and broad-shouldered, his hat in hand. His eyes were kind but guarded, as though he too was unsure of what to expect. He greeted her, softly asking if she had eaten and if she was tired. She could barely answer, but when she looked at him, something eased inside her. He didn't seem to mind her silence. He didn't rush her. He simply carried her trunk and helped her into the wagon, and together they rode toward the fading light as the wheels turned and the land stretched wide before them. Clara felt the weight of every mile between the life she had left and the one ahead. Her heart beat fast, not from fear alone, but from the quiet hope that maybe on this vast open land she might finally find the courage to speak her truth. The sun rose bright over the plains the morning after Clara arrived, and the first sounds she heard were the calls of roosters and the low hum of cattle beyond the fence. The air smelled of dust and hay and something warm, like life beginning again. She stepped out of the small room James had given her and looked out across the land that seemed to have no end. The ranch was larger than anything she had ever imagined. A house built strong with wood that carried the scent of pine, a barn standing proud and weathered, and fields rolling out like waves of gold. It was quiet, except for the wind and the distant sound of horses. The silence felt strange, but also peaceful, like the world had taken a long, slow breath. James greeted her with coffee and a soft smile. He moved with the steadiness of a man who had long learned to rely on himself, yet there was gentleness in his voice that made her want to listen. He told her she did not have to rush into anything, that she could stay as long as she wished and help around the house if she wanted. Clara nodded grateful for the space he offered, though she could barely lift her eyes. To meet his, he showed her the barn, the chicken coop, and the corral where his horses ran, and she followed quietly, listening more than she spoke. When they rode into town a few days later, Clara could feel the eyes of strangers upon her. The people of the small Kansas town whispered as she passed. The shopkeeper smiled, but the women in the mercantile looked her up and down with tight lips. She heard one murmur that the new bride hardly spoke a word. Another said she looked too frail for ranch life. The words stung, but she pretended not to hear. She walked beside James with her hands clasped tight, feeling like a child among grown folk at the ranch. James's daughter Lydia was waiting. A slender girl with brown hair and wary eyes, Lydia watched Clara with a mixture of curiosity and quiet resentment. She had lost her mother 2 years earlier, and her heart had built a wall. Clara tried to speak to her, asking if she liked to read, but Lydia only shrugged and walked away. Clara could not blame her. She knew what it was to lose the only voice that had ever made her feel safe. The days passed, slowly filled with work that both comforted and challenged her. She swept the house, cooked simple meals, and mended torn clothes. She watched James work with the horses, his sleeves rolled and his movements sure. Sometimes he caught her watching and smiled, and she would look away blushing. She wanted to thank him for his patience, but the words always caught in her throat. When she did speak, it was in quiet moments, small sentences offered like timid birds. One evening she saw him struggling with a broken fence, and she whispered that she could help. He handed her a hammer without hesitation, and together they worked until the last of the light faded. He never mocked her for her clumsy swings. He only said softly that she was stronger than she thought. Each night she wrote a few lines in a small notebook, words she could not yet say aloud. I want to belong. I want to be brave. I want to find my voice. The land was rough, the wind sharp, but inside her something was beginning to shift, like the first thaw of spring. She was still shy, still uncertain, but for the first time in her life she began to wonder if her quiet heart might hold more strength than anyone had ever seen. Spring came to the plains with a restless wind that carried both promise and hardship. Clara had grown used to the rhythm of life on the ranch, rising before dawn to feed the chickens and fetch water, her skirts damp with morning dew. She still spoke, little, but her silence no longer felt empty. She had begun to see that words were not the only way to be known. Her hands spoke for her in the way she mended a torn saddle strap or baked biscuits, warm enough to make James smile without saying a thing. One afternoon she found a small foal caught in a fence, its legs scraped and trembling. She knelt beside it, whispering soft sounds that were not quite words until it calmed. Her touch was light and careful, and when James found her there, he watched for a moment before helping lift the frightened creature free. Together they tended to its wounds in the barn, and when it was done, he said quietly that she had a gift with living things. The words warmed her more than the fire that burned. In the hearth that night, Lydia began to soften too, drawn by Clara's patience and her gentle way with the animals. They spent evenings reading by lamplight, Lydia stumbling through her lessons, while Clara listened, her heart swelling with something she did not yet dare to name. It was a quiet companionship built not on talk, but on trust, and little by little Lydia began to smile again. But the land was not always kind. The rains that had promised green pastures failed to come. The earth cracked, Beneath the sun and the grass turned brittle beneath their boots, James rode farther each day searching for water while Clara kept the ranch running. She saw the strain in his face and the weariness in his shoulders. Yet when she tried to speak, her concern, the words tangled inside her throat. One night she overheard him speaking with the neighboring ranch hands. Their voices carried through the open window, rough with worry. They were planning to sell part of the herd to buy feed and water. She wanted to tell them she had noticed a creek still running weak but steady beyond the east ridge hidden by brush. She had seen it on her morning walks, but fear held her back. The men were older, seasoned. She was only the shy mail-order bride. What did she know of ranch work? That night she lay awake, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum. The image of James's tired eyes would not leave her. She rose before dawn, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and walked out toward the ridge. The sun broke slow over the horizon, painting the land in copper and gold. The creek was there, just as she remembered, glinting faintly between the rocks. She followed its path and saw that with a bit of work it could be drawn toward the lower fields. When she returned, she found James by the barn and finally forced herself to speak. The words came halting at first, but once they began, they would not stop. She told him about the creek, about how it might save the crops. He listened silently, then smiled in quiet amazement. Together they spent the day clearing brush and setting small channels for the water to run. By sunset, the dry earth was damp again, and Clara's heart was lighter than it had ever been. The men from town spoke later of how clever James had been to find that creek, but he corrected them, saying it was Clara who had saved the ranch. She blushed and looked away, unable to bear the praise yet. Inside, something steady and fierce took root. For the first time, she had spoken not from fear, but from belief, and it had made a difference. She was still shy, still learning, but she knew now that her voice, however small, could change the shape of her world. Summer brought heat and thunder and the kind of storms that made the ground tremble. Clara had learned to read the sky by then, the gray streaks of cloud that meant rain, the heavy stillness that came before lightning struck. The drought had broken for a while, but the wind returned fiercer than before, and the work on the ranch grew harder with each passing day. She rose earlier and slept later. Her hands rough, her shoulders sore, yet there was a new steadiness in her that no storm could shake. One afternoon the air turned thick and strange, the sky darkened, without warning, and the animals grew restless. James was out in the far pasture mending the fence when the wind began to howl. Lydia ran to the door calling for her father. Clara saw the storm rolling in black and wild, and without a thought for her fear. She ran into the open fields. The rain came down in sheets, the wind tearing at her skirts. She could barely see ahead, but she followed the faint sound of James's voice through the roar of the storm. She found him near the fence, half covered. In mud, the post he had been setting fallen beside him. He had tried to free a trapped calf, and in doing so had been struck by a falling beam. He was breathing but weak, his leg twisted and bleeding. Clara knelt beside him, the rain mixing with her. Tears. She told him she would get help, but he shook his head and told her not to go far. The barn was closer than the house. She could shelter him there if she could find the strength to pull him free. She took hold of him with all the power her small frame could muster and slowly dragged him through the rain toward the barn. The storm screamed around them, but she kept moving, whispering his name like a prayer. By the time she reached shelter, the townsfolk had begun to gather, worried about the damage spreading across the valley. Some of them came to help, but when they saw Clara soaked and trembling, they began to murmur. She heard one voice, sharp and cold, say she had no right to be there, that she was not his real wife. Another said she should go back east before she brought more trouble. Clara froze, her heart pounding. She had never stood against such words before. Then something inside her broke open like the sky itself. She rose to her feet, her voice rising above the wind. She told them that she had worked this land beside James, that she had earned her place here with her own hands. She said she might not have been born a rancher's wife, but she had become one by love and labor, and she would not leave while the man who trusted her lay hurt. She spoke without trembling, her words clear and fierce. The people fell silent. Even the wind seemed to ease its howl when the storm passed and the night grew calm. She sat beside James in the barn, his head resting against her shoulder. He opened his eyes, weak but smiling, and told her he had heard her. He said he had known she had strength, but had never imagined how much it could shine when she let it. He called her brave, and she felt the truth of it in her bones. For the first time, she did not shrink from her own power. She had faced a storm both outside and within, and had stood tall through it all. The days after the storm passed slowly, as if the land itself needed time to heal. The sun returned, soft and golden, and the air smelled of wet earth and new grass. Clara spent her mornings tending to James's wounds, washing his bandages and reading aloud from an old book she had found on the shelf. He listened with half-closed eyes, his voice rough when he thanked her for staying close. Lydia helped too, bringing water and sitting quietly beside them. Sometimes she would reach for Clara's hand and hold it without a word, and in those moments, Clara felt that the walls between them had finally fallen. The ranch began to breathe again. The neighbors who had once doubted her came to offer help, bringing supplies and kind words. They spoke differently now, their tones careful, respectful. They had seen her stand tall in the storm, and they no longer called her the shy bride. She still spoke gently, but her voice no longer trembled. She gave directions when help was needed. And the ranch hands listened without question. James watched her from the porch, his eyes warm with pride. When he was strong enough to walk again, they took slow steps together through the fields. The grass shimmered green beneath the morning light, and the creek she had found months ago still ran clear. The horses lifted their heads as they passed, as if to greet them. James stopped near the old fence post, the one that had fallen during the storm, and looked at her with a quiet smile. He said he had been thinking about what she had said that night about belonging and courage and love. He told her that if she would have him still, he wanted to make her his wife, not because she owed him anything, but because she had become the heart of the ranch and the keeper of his peace. For a moment, she could not breathe. The old Clara would have blushed and looked away, but the woman she had become stood tall. Her voice came steady as she told him yes, but only if he would promise to listen to her words as carefully as she listened to his. He laughed softly and said he would listen to her for the rest of his life. She smiled, then truly smiled, and it felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. The wedding was small, a gathering of friends, neighbors, and a few travelers who happened to pass through. Lydia wore a ribbon in her hair and stood proudly beside them as Clara and James exchanged their vows beneath the open sky. There were no grand speeches, only quiet promises carried by the wind. When James lifted her hand to his lips, she felt the warmth of everything they had endured together and everything they would still face side by side. That evening, as the sun sank low, Clara sat by the window with pen and paper in hand. She wrote a letter to the boarding house keeper back east, thanking her for the years of shelter and telling her she had found a home. She ended the letter with words she had never dared to write before. I once thought silence kept me safe, but love has taught me that a voice is not something to hide. It is something to share and to live by. Outside, the sky stretched wide and full of color. The ranch quiet, except for the hum of crickets and the gentle creak of the barn door. James called her name, and she turned. her face toward the sound, her heart calm and sure. She was no longer the shy girl who had traveled west. In fear, she was Clara Walker Rancher, wife, mother, and woman of courage, and her voice would never again be silent.